simply true that once you go out and do the research, there is a mountain of evidence that goes toward this interpretation of the lost lands. So there's almost too much to work with. That's why the book is so overcrowded with detail. Right around when the New Age got really going, you know, in the 70s, this whole new literature started in the press. And it's basically called New Age, although it covers, you know, so much stuff that really isn't just that. At the same time, the proto-historians in the world began to, you know, take a good look at what was going on in the very deep ancient past in the earth. And a lot of material got built up on its own myths, like Atlantis, the Ice Age, the Bering Crossing, just countless effects of proto-history. And I'll just say that instead of saying prehistory, I'm saying proto-history, because we're going back beyond the Neolithic to a period more than 10,000 years ago, when it's anybody's guess what was happening, unless you study OSPE. You know, since the 70s, the literature built up and built up to give us a picture, many authors, dozens of authors, to give us a picture of what the deep past was like, you know, beyond the Neolithic, 12,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. And then, of course, there's all the Darwinian literature, which is monumental, which is, you know, becoming established. But so much of my work, not that I planned it this way, but that it just had to be done, is to look at the way the textbooks are written, or even the most popular theories, what they're based on, and it does not conform with what I have learned in OSPE and what I have done to check out that material in the world of research. It does not conform. Let me get to bottom line here, give one pertinent example. Atlantis. The lost continent of Atlantis. You know, for years it bothered me, you know, about this Atlantis. And I believed in it in the beginning, of course, when I was a beginner studying these things. You hear it all over the place, Atlantis. You don't hear nothing about Pan. But I found out by researching this and reading deeply in OSPE, the biggest lost continent on Earth was in the Pacific Ocean, that it was not 12,000 years ago, like the books say and the articles say, but 24,000 years ago. You can't understand anything in isolation. The destruction itself, and I'll give another bottom line point here, I might as well, is that it was not a natural catastrophe, the submersion of Pan. It was not a natural disaster. It was nothing like the natural disasters. The entire subsidence of an immense continent has no natural explanation. It was, as all the mythology and legend around the world indicates and remembers, sunken to the deep by the gods, by the will of the gods. The story is very beautifully told in OSPE, in the Book of Off. This was the last book in a series of 3 that I wrote. And I've gone on to other topics, other interests since completing it, but somehow to give the histories that are recorded in OSPE and translate them to the people of the world it took 3 books, and this is all about Proto History. The first, I didn't know it was a series. It was only years after I completed them all that I saw it for what it was, a trilogy. The first was about the little people. I was most inspired to write about that. Really the only book about the little people. The second book was a refutation of Darwinian evolution. The final, the ultimate was to just do it and get down and boogie with Pan and get that over with. And that's what this book came out of. So it was a series of 3. It was about the little people. They are known as the I-hens or the E-hens in Oaspe. Secondly, Darwinian evolution is very relevant to this. It's also important to, if you want to understand what this is all about, to understand that we all knew about the sinking of Pan, only we called it the flood. In fact, we call it Noah's flood. And the Bible, the Christian Bible, the Ezra Bible, gives an account of it, but so do all the great mythologies of the world give, many of them giving extensive account of the flood. So that's a major little piece of the puzzle we're putting into place here, because the sinking of Pan in the Pacific Ocean 24,000 years ago was the flood. And Noah and his family were the survivors. And the survivors goes back to the little people, because that's who the survivors were. The E-hens on Pan were the last of their race on Earth. The rest had been exterminated in the Old World and in the New World. The larger races, the Ihans, and the Druk people exterminated the sacred little people. And the only place left that they were left in the world was in the mountain refuges in the land of Pan. If you try to picture it, you can see that this was an episode in Earth life when everyone turned against the sacred little people, and it was a genocide. They were persecuted. The gods got together and said, hey, this is not okay. So the only way to preserve the higher character of mankind was to save the E-hens, to not let them go extinct. And so the plan came about among the gods. This is totally unique. This never happened before in history and will never happen again. But it happened then. One god ago, 124,000-year unit ago. It was impossible to resurrect any of the souls of Earth because they had sunken so low, other than the I-hens. And so, and Pan was the only place where the I-hens lived, and they were hiding out. So it was arranged for them to be warned of a great flood, to build ships to get out of there and go settle in the other parts of the world, and for the continent to go down, because there was no other matter, and this gets into cosmological stuff that's maybe too advanced, but there was no other way to deal with the dark spirits that were surrounding the heavens of the continent.
The spiritual aspect of it is a lot more interesting, and it's got a life of its own. I mean, we see this destructing planet. You know, this half of the planet that goes under the water, and people say, "What kind of God is that?"
Right.
You know, what kind of God's got angry and why? You know, so
the wrath
so
of God.
what did happen?
It was precisely said in the verses of Owaspe that this was an act of mercy, that a good surgeon removes a gangrene limb. Almost exactly that analogy is given to explain, to save the earth and to give it a future.
We do have a very simplistic analogy of this in these myths that we have left behind.
Yes, but there's a pretty good concordance, agreement with the Christian Bible when, as far as this goes. The Christian Bible says Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the Owaspe Bible says Noah, although that name is not used, had 5 sons, and they were principally the 5 tribes of Phethus, Ihans, on Pan. The ships were given these names: Shem, Ham, Japheth, Yista, and Gautama. So Yista is Japan, and Gautama is America. So they went out at the time of their rescue. Their escape from the Johnny continent. They went out to those 5 divisions of the world: Shem to India, Ham to Africa, Japheth to China, Yista to Japan, and Gautama to America.
Now you mentioned Noah. Now we know from Owaspe that Noah is actually a figurative way of speaking about the time and,
yes,
and the overarching light of the time. The Ark of Noah.
Oh, okay. That jogged my memory for to say Noé. Language is as good as DNA. You know, as far as holding memory and source of identifying what you're talking about. Hasn't been exploited much, but I exploited it. I've been a language nut my whole life, and so this comes naturally to me, to see linguistic connections, to see cognates. A cognate is a word in one language that corresponds to a word in a totally different language, or in a related language. I always believed Spanish was a very old language. I think it's the oldest language of Europe besides Basque. Spanish, España, and...
The spirit of Pan.
Yeah. S is spirit and Pan is Pan. I think the book has a few hundred carryovers from the word Pan to modern language. The easiest one to refer to is the prefix Pan in English. Oh God, there's so many. My mind is just exploding. Panacea,
yeah.
Panoply, pandemic. You know, panoply. Pan-American, Pan-Asian. It means all. It goes back to the original huge continent in which civilization had its start. I had a lot of Pan names and Pan words in front of me, really hundreds for the book. And they're all, I mean, what is pan in Spanish? Bread. Pan is bread in Spanish. That's earth. I found a lot of Pan words for rivers all over the world. Rivers, towns, villages, mountains, but they are concentrated in one part of the world. Pan names for kingdoms and districts and every part of a geographical description in Central America. Starting with Copan, some of the most famous archaeological sites in America, in Central America, and going on and on and on. Okay, we'll get into the specifics of the fleet called Gautama that landed in the Western Hemisphere, and it landed, Oasby says it landed in the Middle Kingdom, and that would be in Central America, and specifically that would be Guatemala. And Guatemala is obviously just built on Gautama, the very ancient and unknown word of the fleet to America. So there's a very strong confirmation there that yes, indeed, the fleet to Guatemala landed in the Middle Kingdom and traveled north and south in the interior, and that's how the Western Hemisphere was settled. It was settled in a major way 24,000 years ago with the fleet of Gautama, the landing in Guatemala, and the movement north and south in the interior. And even this part is confirmed by what archaeology tells us, because the older settlements in the New World are in the interior, and the more recent, as they spread out from the interior, are along the coast. The sons of Noah did not make it to either coast. Those are later people and later developments. The Bering Strait theory is one of those myths that has been stricken down in recent years, but people haven't paid enough attention. Jeffrey Goodman, in one of his terrific books in the 1980s, devoted a whole chapter to debunking, and it is certainly correct. But that's, 40 years ago, and they're still feeding this problem to the masses. Just to touch on the Africa, there's another one out of Africa myth, which the Darwinists and Neo-Darwinists and all the textbooks and all the academia will tell you with a straight face that mankind came out of Africa and settled the world. Nothing could be, and that's politically motivated too, which is a separate talk, but nothing could be further from the truth, even archaeologically, geographically. And this is a good example of how the trilogy of books fit in. The 11th chapter in the anti-Darwin book, which is called The Mysterious Origins of Hybrid Man, chapter 11 is about the out of Africa myth. Just because there were migrations from Africa, that doesn't mean that Homo sapiens marched out of there and became everybody else. How do you get black people to turn into white people? That's the key thing. And there were anthropologists 50, 75 years ago who said the same thing, but we didn't listen to them. This entire history, proto-history, had to be broken down into three areas. The little people, their entire history, Darwinism, which is false, and Pan, the true lost continent of antiquity, and how it shaped all human history thereafter.
Language, as far as the proof of Pan, is said in Oasby that these symbols and these words will last right up until Cosmo, which is our time. So the fact that you're doing language research to confirm Oasby, it doesn't seem to be a coincidence to me. It seems to be the way that was planned to carry it forth into our time.
I started calling it archaeolinguistics. Just to give it a name, give it stature. I started out saying that language is rich with the past. But I feel like a total nerd, being the only one I know who does this, who gets into these long lists of syllables that show up in every part of the world. If this, in other words, I just had to throw it out to show that it's there, and it's very undeveloped. If this became a science of its own, Well, see, this has not become a science of its own because we are trying to adhere to the old paradigm, which, you know, doesn't invite things like this because this really spreads the light all the way out. But there's a world of work there, and anyone else who is into the language part is welcome to contact me and discuss how we could take this further along.
If you were to weigh up all the proofs of Pan, what would you say would be the most significant?
Well, okay, let's look at the table of contents, because that lays it out. Okay, Chapter 2 emphasizes the white race, the Caucasoid race, coming out of the Pacific 20,000 years ago. The races of man, and how to explain them, and their mixing, their origins.
So the Europeans, how does historians, conventional historians say the Europeans got?
Okay, they say the Aryans came out of the Iranian plateau. That's standard textbook BS. Caucasian people were in the old world much earlier than that, than the Aryan invasion, whatever they latched onto to give Western man a fairly local setting for his origin. Let me just say this. It's pretty clear-cut to me that the son of Noah, called Japheth, was primarily the progenitor of the European people and the Indo-European languages. Japheth, of course, is the son that landed in China. You know, I'm putting this in cartoonish language, but you know what I'm saying. There was a westward migration of these Eastern peoples. Turtward says the people who came out of Mu made their first settlement in China. But eventually, let's skip all of that and get to the desertification of the Gobi Desert 15,000 years ago, around there, and same-wise, the desertification of much of Central Asia and North Asia over the thousands of years, people moving westward until barely perceptible prehistoric times when they were in Western, in Asia Minor, which is Turkey. The final point is just that the people of Europe, the founding of London, can be traced back to today's land of Turkey. Of course, there's always mixing to account for, but we're talking about the dominant pattern. Where did people come from? There are some definite Polynesian strains of DNA and blood type in Native America. And before the Indian type was here, they have this in their legends, particularly the Cherokees who are in the region I'm in. Before the Cherokees say, before we marched down and arrived here, when we arrived there were little people here, the Nunehi and the Yunwi-Sundi. They eventually conquered them. And so the tiny little white races were here upon this continent and blended big time with the indigenous people.
OASPI does tell us that in Asia there were different people to the Asians before the Spenteramage cycle, and then they got wiped out.
Right, and the big hoo-ha in online archaeology are the red-headed mummies in China. There's been a lot said about that. You can find out about that. Fair skin, men with ginger beards, Europoid features. These were the sons of Japheth. Pacific on the eastern side is white and European, types, you know, particularly your Polynesian beauties. On the western side, Melanesia, that word itself, mel, is coloring, you know, deep colored people of black skin. And every kind of intermediate type as well, all across the Pacific. Don't forget, it's an enormous expanse of ocean covering 25,000 islands. So just about every human type is there.
And you'll hear people say that, oh well, there were explorers there and there were mariners.
Yeah, those are excuses to uphold the old paradigm. Darwinian evolution demands that it happen in one place, and they figure it's Africa because there were monkeys there. And you know, they just kept evolving until they got better and better. No help from God or the angels, just natural selection. So this is the old paradigm that happened in one place, the Garden of Eden, Africa. Nonsense. Every part of the world had its little white people, had its indigenous brown people, had all the mixtures that took place over the eons. There is no Garden of Eden. The sinking of Pan took place 24,000 years ago. That is actually a figure, an approximate figure to be found in the mathematical calculations of Owaspe, which come under, you can put it under the heading of prophetic numbers, which refers to units of time that help you predict, understand the past and predict the future. The prophetic numbers run from 11 years to the Gadol, 24,000 years, all the way up to 500,000 years plus. These prophetic numbers give a rhythm to things that happen on the earth. The rhythms have to be explained in and of themselves, but things do happen recurrently and according to periodicities that we're not totally clued in on. But we're learning to work with the prophetic numbers. The point I'm trying to make is that we have reached the end of that Gadol since the sinking of Pan.
Exactly. Now, with Pan, we had the Ihins, who seeded the new race, the Ihuans, and then the Gan, and the people who we are today. And we're told in Owaspe that this new Gadol is the beginning of Cosman. And we have the new Cosman man. Now, what are they looking at? Now, in Owaspe, it was the spiritual progression of man, and physically it was manifested in his physicality. So this is what we're looking forward to, a new man.
In Cosman, yes, that's exactly right. That the Gadol is also the marking point for the birth of Cosman, which is the new life for man on this planet, the new great life for man. This is the biggest dividing line the human race will ever see. I've been doing some writing recently based on the Owaspe knowledge of Cephas and what Cephas is. It's in a nutshell, it's man being ruled from above, from a hierarchy of power. Earthly power, exploitive power, and all of that is ending now with the beginning of the new Gadol and with the coming of the light of Cosman. In this time we will rule ourselves. Self-rule is the bylaw for what's coming now, so prepare yourself, because it will only be successful with discipline and harmony. No other way.
So when you say self-rule, that's our self-discipline and connecting with the inner that's within us, that spark of the Creator that's within us, and who gives us our individuality.
Yes, and not denying the spark that's in you. Because every one of you has it. And it dims down to darkness if you don't keep it alive. Trust in yourself, trust in your Creator to bring you closer to the light, closer to the harmony. It's destiny. You got everything on your side if you trust that way.
Well, thank you, Susan. That was really enlightening to hear your views and to hear it directly, because reading your book is very interesting, but to hear you and expressing, it sinks in.
I just want to say, because you used that word expression, I just want to say about the spirit part, because, you know, we always say that for last, talk about the last, and we will. But the spirit part, I just want to tell you, the best teaching in OASPE about the spirit part is that the way to build your spirit is to express, to give of yourself. That's it. That's the whole formula right there. So don't hide away. Use that spark. Keep it glowing.